In today's episode of My Podcast Story, we have David Beckemeyer, the insightful host of the Outrage Overload podcast. David dives deep into the complexity of political polarization and media literacy, aiming to reduce toxic outrage and foster civil discourse in our increasingly divided society. With a background steeped in social psychology and communication studies, he brings a unique perspective to the conversation, helping listeners navigate the often tumultuous waters of modern media. That's a lot. David's mission is not just to analyze the outrage industry, but to equip his audience with practical strategies for promoting understanding and unity. He's here to share his inspiring journey on how he built his show from the ground up and the impactful work he's doing to change the narrative around political discourse. Tell us your name, the name of your podcast, and what your podcast is about.
Yeah, I'm David Beckemeyer, and my show is called Outrage Overload, and it's about outrage in society, outrage in politics, and lowering the temperature. So kind of about the toxic polarization environment that we're in. And I talk to scientists and researchers and practitioners and other experts, authors about that, and then we bring some of that research and expertise to the audience.
How long have you been doing the podcast?
I started the show in 2022, late 2022, so a little over 2 years. I guess it'll be 3 years at the end of this year.
So that's about 5 years.
No, about only a little over 2 years. Yeah. 2022, right at the beginning, end of 2022, right at the beginning of 2023. So yeah, it's a little more than 2 years, 2.5 years about.
Okay. Well, congrats. For
Thanks.
having the show. Yeah, go beyond 2-3 months. Fellow persons quits the first podcast.
Yeah, for sure. I started one, I quit. I couldn't do it. It was too hard. I started one before and I didn't get very far.
Well, you started and then you quit. I love to hear that story. What happened?
Well, it was just a lot of work to get guests for that topic. I was doing I was trying to do a podcast about sort of family storytelling and, and how you might bring, talk to, along, somebody that like an older relative, like a grandfather or an uncle or something like that, or an uncle or aunt, and, capture these stories. And I was trying to get guests about that topic, and it was just kind of hard to find folks that really wanted to talk about that topic. So I think the topic was just a little too niche.
Okay. So when you started the podcast, how many months did you kind of like take to like kind of figure out things out and then come back to start doing the podcast again?
Well, the show that I'm doing now, I researched for a while. It was at least 3 or 4 months, just kind of researching that, like, what do I even want to do? Because I wasn't too sure. I kind of was starting to sense that there was a lot going on, but then I didn't know that much about it. So I researched this whole area around kind of this toxic polarization idea and the kind of outrage media. And I researched that for a while. And then before I even settled, I didn't know if I wanted to do a YouTube channel or just write. It was maybe just a blog and just write about it. And then I settled on a podcast, seemed to be a good format. So I could go with the podcast, I could go a little deeper, more than just a 5-minute news segment. I could go a little deeper, and I could still do it without, without the restrictions of public media or a broadcast media kind of thing. So we could go deeper. We could go off topic, things like that, and you could do that with a podcast. So and I thought audio is about all I could handle. Video is a little too much for me, especially back then. So that's how I settled on an audio podcast. You mentioned you started a podcast the first time and you realized that it was a lot and you had to pause. When was this? Is this the same show or a different show? That was a different show that I thought I was going to start up, and it kind of didn't go that well at first. So it was just becoming more work than I wanted to put into for finding the guests for that topic. But for this show, in terms of Outrage Overload, I was pretty lucky. I was very concerned at the beginning of whether I'd be, because I'm kind of a nobody in this space. I'm not a researcher or scientist, and I'm not even technically a journalist, or it certainly wasn't then. And so I was concerned that it would be hard to get, kind of these world-renowned scientists to come on the show and other practitioners and things like that, just to come on kind of a nobody's show. But I really lucked out and was able to score some good guests right off the bat. And then from there, it just continued. So that part worked out well. That was one of the biggest concerns I had, is am I going to be able to get these folks to come on my show? But luckily they did. It was very gracious about it. And I was able to really land some good guests, and I've been able to, keep that going. So that was one thing that I got through that. And of course, my other big concern was how do you promote these things, and and how do you build an audience? And that's still a challenge, right? That one doesn't go away.
Yeah. Right now, can you walk us through how you find guests and reach out to them and then have them book a time on your calendar to record the meeting?
Yeah, so my show is I go my approach is sort of topic first, person second. So I'm not really I'm not looking for celebrities or a certain name or a certain person. I go out and look for research that is related to my topic, and then I go find who are the authors of that research and reach out then. So it's kind of topic first, person second. So a lot of that research occurs on Google Scholar, which is it's kind of like a version of Google that has published peer-reviewed scientific research. So I can use Google Scholar to try to find topics. I also, have a lot of Google alerts set, and I look for new papers being launched on all the various peer-reviewed scientific journals, and I see what's new there. And so that's the main way that I find things, and then and also just in the news in general, topics being written, and then I'll maybe and find out what else that person has done, and maybe invite them to the show to talk about maybe an article they wrote somewhere, whether it was technically a scientific journal or not, but somehow related to the topic. And then, of course, now that I've had the show for a while and kind of am building a reputation in that space, of course, people come to me now wanting to come on the show as well. So it's a little bit of both, but most of it is researching scientific research in this bridge building toxic polarization landscape.
I'm curious to know how you got the images of these persons. I mean, it's one thing to see their name and see the work they published on. How do you actually get their email to contact them?
You mean sort of build a reputation out there? Is that what you mean?
For the guests, right? Once you've seen their profile, their work on journals and all that, how do you actually get their email to contact them and message them?
Oh, yeah. It can be hard. It can be hard. I mean, sometimes they'll have social media, and I'll try to reach out on social media. If some of them are like professors at schools, so they have a school email, and I can reach out through their school email, through their university email. But yeah, it can be a challenge. That is definitely one of the harder things, is figuring out how to get hold of folks. Because I always see these people on TV saying, "Oh, I just called, Senator so and so." How did you just call Senator so and so? How do you just do that? I don't know how to call the senator. They're not going to pick up the phone.
How do you get number in the first place?
I don't know if there is a single best place. It's usually just groundwork, just kind of jumping around, trying to find somebody that maybe knows them, or that I don't have a single magic place that I could go to for sure. But obviously, you kind of Google around, and then maybe you find social media, and then maybe from social media, you see if there's somebody else that's connected, and you might be able to get a connection that way, or a referral, something like that. So yeah, it's definitely a lot of legwork.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier on that at the beginning, what you could handle was just the audio of the podcast. So right now, have you moved to video, or are you just doing audio only?
The show itself is still audio. I do record video when I do an interview, and I sometimes will use those clips on like social media. And some interviews I have published, the video, that the whole video, or at least the edited video. But the main podcast is still audio only, and then sort of supplemented with some video here and there.
Okay, so the YouTube it's there, but it's not like that's active as much as the podcast. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, in some sense, for me, YouTube is almost like a file storage place, because I do put the episodes there and stuff, but I don't do a lot of work to really try to grow that channel yet. Because again, I don't have a lot of video content yet, so it's still kind of just a placeholder. Obviously, people can go there. All the episodes are there, and they're just with like a static image, right? There's no video; it's just the audio playing with a static image. And those kind of videos, of course, are never that popular on YouTube. But so I kind of have the placeholder for it, but I have not really put the full energy into building YouTube yet.
Well, you did mention that you do record the guests when you have the interviews. Other than making clips, like what's the roadblock from just editing and publishing on YouTube at the same time you publish the audio version?
Yeah, I mean, again, even building clips is kind of a lot of work. I haven't found a magic way that I really like at it yet. So I'll sometimes just build clips in like Final Cut Pro, which is just a straight video tool, and then I take those clips and sometimes send them over to Descript, if you're familiar with that service, and then I'll use Descript's little kind of bolt-ons to add captions and some other things on there. So it's still quite a bit of work to make those videos. I haven't found any of the automation tools yet. Maybe they are, and they just don't work for me. But I haven't found any. Oh, first of all, they're not all. The cheap level, the free level is often not very capable. So then you have to pay for a higher level service, and so I haven't found one of those to be really perfect for me yet. It haven't been really worth the money for how much they charge for what you do. But I think probably know the kind of tools I'm talking about, like Opus Clips and things like that. But that I haven't settled on any of those yet.
Well, okay. I just wanted you to walk us through currently what's making a podcast episode for you right now looks like from start to finish, and let us know if you like include the apps, the tools, the persons, and etc.
Yeah, so the first step for me is that research step, right? Kind of, is there a topic out there that has some interesting research? And if I find an interesting research or a practitioner, that's working in has done some work and has achieved something in the space of kind of trying to do this kind of bridge building work, which is kind of bringing polar opposites together in some way. And so that's the first step, is kind of all that research. Then once I nail down that, then I sort of start all that reach out process to try to get hold of them and try to schedule the actual interview. So I use, I have a tool that's kind of like, what's the most popular one everybody uses? Calendly. It's kind of like that, but it's another tool called Calendar Hero that I use. So then that's
Wow.
integrated on the web.
First time I'm hearing of it.
Uh-huh. Yeah, and so then that is used to actual nail down the specific date once the person agrees. Once they agree to come on the show, and then sort of the work starts. So that's all the part to get the interview recorded, and then the second half of it is I have a whole workflow about handling or about turning that into an episode, right? So after the recording, I mean, I have to prep all the questions, of course, before the interview, and I still, leave some flexibility. So I try to at least have an outline and some questions prepared, but then I try to have flexibility for however the conversation might go. But I'm, and I've improved. I've gotten better as an interviewer. So I usually don't have to do as much editing because I've done a little bit better during the interview. But things can go sideways, or you hear a whole different conversation than you expected, and that's like more interesting than the thing you thought you were going to record and stuff like that. But then so once the interview is recorded, then I have a whole workflow, which for the most part my episodes kind of have a set format. But not all, but for the interview episodes, they kind of have a set format where I do like a setup in the beginning, a short setup, and I've shortened those. In the beginning, I was doing really long ones. Those episodes still do good with the really long ones, but some people say they don't want that, so I've shortened those up a little bit to get into the interview a little quicker. So I have the setup piece, and then I have the interview itself, and then I have kind of the outro. And the setup piece kind of has a standard format too. It kind of has a hook. And then we kind of talk about the problem that we're talking about, why are we talking about this? Then I introduce the guest, just a quick introduction of the guest and talking about their credentials and why they're a good person to talk about this. And then we some kind of a call to action to jump into the episode. And that's pretty standard. So then I kind of have those main three parts. I have a set little 15-second welcome music, and then I have this setup that I do. Then I have the interview. Then I have the outro, which is, like closing credits and all that. And that's pretty much my set format. So then once I have the interview, I edit the interview first. So I am edited. So I do, fairly extensive editing, although depending on how good the interviews, some interviews, I don't need hardly any editing. Other ones, I'm sometimes rearranging things, or obviously pulling out questions that don't keep the flow going, things like that. So I'm editing those interviews for flow and not changing. I'm not trying to change the content or the message. I don't misrepresent anybody, but I might take stuff out just to keep the flow going, things like that. So then once the interview is edited, then I go back and do the setup thing, because now I kind of have the final version of the interview. Then I'll figure out, because I don't want to say something in the setup that I took out of the interview, right? So I don't do that first. So then I'll do the setup piece and assemble that and do the narration for that and record that. And then I bolt all those pieces together and set it up to be released. So I'll schedule it up to be released. And then, of course, you have all that other piece of it right now. So you've also got to write show notes. I do a little web page for every episode, so I've got to sort of prepare that web page episode, and have a bio for the guest and all that sort of stuff. And then I do an email with each episode. So I get that email kind of ready too. And those can vary in length. Sometimes they're just a quick little, here's the episode, but I try to make them kind of stand alone and have something interesting, some separate, interesting reason to exist. So they're not just, not always just kind of an advertisement. They'll try to be something, some more value added content in that email. And then of course all the social media, once the episode goes out, then there's all the steps to sort of social media and all that stuff to try to promote it after the fact. And so that's kind of what my workflow looks like. I don't know if I left off a few steps, but that's the main workflow. And I pretty much do all that myself, all the scripting and narration and all that myself. And I'll go find clips and things like that to edit into that setup sometimes. And I mix in music a little bit sometimes as well. So there's all that going on as well.
Wow. Wow. You didn't what software do you use for remote recording? Hey, just a quick break. If you enjoying the insights so far and want even more behind the scenes ideas, inspiration and tools for growing your own podcast, join my email list at mypodcaststory.com/join. That is mypodcaststory.com/join. You get access to helpful resources, exclusive updates, and the kind of stuff I only share with my email subscribers. Whether you're starting out or already podcasting, there's something valuable waiting for you. Head over to mypodcaststory.com/join and subscribe. Now, back to the episode.
Because I don't want to have any barrier or any impediment for the guests that I'm doing, I want to make it as easy as possible. I'm just recording on Zoom because they all know Zoom. I don't have to give them another piece of software or a different website. Most of these professors and experts, like they already know how to use Zoom. So at some point I might go to something that's a little higher quality, but for me, Zoom has worked, for the most part. I haven't lost any recordings. And since I don't use the video, obviously they don't use the video that much except for social media clips and stuff. The video is not great with Zoom, right? But it's been okay for what I need it for. But I'm still considering some of these other options. But I have heard nightmare stories, and I don't want to give these. I don't have that much cachet with these professors and stuff, so I don't want to give them any reason to not do it.
Yeah, 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 yeah. That's true. I mean, I don't know, probably maybe because my guests, most of them, they're like pretty used to the industry, so that's why maybe I've never had any complaints of like, oh, this software is not working, or what am I supposed to do? Right? Yeah, and it's
Right.
one thing to consider. Yeah.
Yeah, and I've used several of them for other shows, and I've even played around with using them. I never did, produce an episode using any of them that actually made it on the show, but I did experiment with some of them, and I had some difficulty with a few of these ones. I don't know if you want to mention which one you're using, but some of the ones like what you're using, and some others, some of the web-based ones, and I had some trouble. Like they were being weird, and I'd lose some audio, and I'm like, okay, maybe I don't like this that much. They're probably getting better.
Yeah, they're getting better. Yeah. I mean, the first time the thing is, there's so many factors that come into choosing the tool, the softwares, and all those things you use, right? Right now, you're not focusing on video so much, right? And so you're using just Zoom. But in the future, where you realize that, okay, if I focus on video, it's going to like lead to more growth and all those things, then it becomes something that is necessary for you to do. But at the point in time, like it's not necessary because, you're not really doing that thing. It doesn't really matter. Yeah, but with Zoom, a lot of persons use Zoom, and Zoom is great, gets the job done, and that's the most important thing, gets the job done, right? And then later on, you can start optimize and making some changes. Uh, I want us to go back to like before you even start the podcast, right? What was like the inspiration that led to you starting the podcast? What inspired? What were you hoping to get out of make out of the podcast? When I say make, I'm not talking about money. I'm just talking about like what was it like? Oh, I'm going to use this podcast to do this thing.
Yeah. I mean, so here in the States, and I know there's some here in the United States, but also some other countries are suffering some of this as well. We have, the populace is very divided. We're very, kind of attached to our politics, and it's really found its way into other parts of our lives. And we had a big election in 2016 that really riled a lot of people up, and that caused people to start like breaking friendships. And everybody seems to have a story like Uncle so and so is not allowed to Thanksgiving anymore or whatever. They're not allowed to some family event, or I don't speak to my brother-in-law anymore, stuff like that. Everybody seems to have stories like that. And then we had the pandemic in 2020, and we had lockdowns, and we had a lot of more fights about that, and the same kind of thing happened there. People breaking friendships and getting in a lot of fights about things. So, all that was kind of going on in my life, and seeing friends doing, breaking friendships and disconnecting with family and stuff like that. And I sort of just got to this point of, well, in outrage overload, I guess I'll say, where it was just like, why are we doing this? What's going on? Like, how can we maybe, what are some ways, why is this happening? What are some of the science around it, like the psychology, neuroscience, and things like that around it? Because I'm kind of a science geek. And then who is anybody looking at this problem? Maybe political scientists and others, and sociologists and others, and maybe, what are some ways out of it? So that's what drove me to it. Just all this was kind of going on in my life, and I wasn't the only one. And I thought, well, let's see if we can understand this a little better and find out. And then I did discover that, of course, a lot of scientists are looking at this problem and consider it one of the biggest problems in society right now. And so there's a lot of work being done on it. So I thought, well, I can share a lot of that research and science that's happening with people and try to maybe we'll understand a little better. And then others in this, what I call practitioners, there's a bunch of organizations, like some thousands and thousands of these organizations that are trying to work on this problem in sort of practical ways, like bringing people together for dialogue, doing civic operations. So maybe getting people involved in a local politics, like maybe working on some issue in their local area, schools or roads or something else, and then having to work with people across these political divides to solve real problems. So that's where it all came from, is all this was happening in my life. And then I realized I wasn't the only one. And so maybe I can help. And there's nobody really talking about this very much, right? The media is part of the problem. They're trying to get us mad at each other all the time. Politicians try to rile us up and get us mad at each other all the time. So there's not many people that aren't playing that game. Even a lot of podcasts kind of play that game, right? They're trying to get you riled up too, because it's a good way to build a podcast. If you want to build a podcast today, you could probably start one in some political thing and take a really strong stance and try to get people riled up all the time, and your numbers will probably grow. You can probably build a show like that. But I wanted to do something that wasn't that. It wasn't happening very much.
Yeah, I guess the best type of content one could create is when you sit down and ask yourself, well, what's the kind of content I would love to consume? And then you look around and like, oh, there's nobody making that stuff. I'll make it for myself. And usually that's it. Because at the end of the day, it's irrespective of whether you get listeners or views, which is nice, but irrespective of whether you get listeners or views, you made the content for you, like you're the first consumer of the content. While you're doing it, while you're making it, you're enjoying it and having fun. So if you get views, great. If you don't, awesome. Like, yeah.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Right. I mean, there really was nobody producing this kind of content. And I still don't think there really is anybody kind of really focused on it in the same way that I am, which is, I think, one thing that really helped get me some acceptance in this whole bridge building work community, even though I'm not technically a scientist or anybody, I'm not really doing that kind of work, or I wasn't before. So yeah, I think because not very many people are doing this kind of work, it's really helped within this, sort of, big fish, small pond community, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, okay. So now that it's going on to 2-3 years right now. How's the podcast doing? Not in terms of numbers, not in terms of all those things, but in terms of you had a purpose, right? You're the creator of the podcast, so you had kind of like a purpose. So we're looking at the podcast, cross-referencing it with that purpose you had in mind. How's it doing?
Yeah, no, it's been a lot. In many ways, it's been like unbelievable, the reception of it, right? Particularly in this sort of scientific and this kind of bridge building world community, right? I'm now basically a member of that community, and I've been added to things like there's something called the Listen First Coalition, and my podcast is part of that. I'm one of like 5 podcasts that they reference on there, and things like that. And in the community, I have now people in this whole space, like all these college professors that will actually take my email and answer me and help me out and even come on the show. I have recurring. Some folks have come back recurring. I've invited them back. So I mean, that part is all amazing. And same with the listenership, the community. It's a small community, but it's dedicated and engaged and interested in this topic. And and when I hear these kind of stories about your show, really helped me deal with a certain situation or become less stressed out about politics, or just handle a situation with my, uncle that I didn't talk to before, things like that. Those are great stories. I mean, you still get people saying, that are still sort of stuck in it, right? But they still listen. Like they want to break out of it, but they have a hard time. And so they're still listening to the show, but sometimes complaining, going, you just keep telling me to listen to the other side and it's not working, So I keep trying to sort of focus on that. Like, what are some ways I can actually help these listeners understand what's going on, and maybe practical tools. So I bring on as many people as I can with some of those more practical side of it. Like, what can you do in practice?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good thing you mentioned. What are some ways I can make the content, the podcast, the episode better and meet the needs of my listeners? Now, I want to ask you now, over the course of 3 years you've been doing the podcast, have you ever spoken directly to your listeners?
I could probably do that more. I definitely do, but I think that's something I could do more. It's a little bit different stylistically than I, usually am, but I do that. I certainly do it, in the outro and often in that intro, I try to as well. But it's something I think I could do more.
Yeah. Okay. Forgive me. Later on, when you started answering the question, I realized that the question I asked was the wrong question. More like it wasn't exactly what I wanted to ask. Have you ever had the opportunity to have a conversation with your listeners, sort of the way we're talking right now, where you're like asking me, oh, what would you like to listen more of? Oh yeah, this stuff. Do you like the intro? What do you like? Get to like see them, kind of like product feedback, stuff like that.
Yeah, I'm kind of crazy for that. Like, I'll try to reach out to anybody that will talk to me, right? If I get contacted, because as you know, podcast listeners, you don't always get their tech info. But if I get their contact info, I will ask them, hey, do you want to sit down for a Zoom call, or a phone call, and give me 15 or 20 minutes, and so yeah, I live for that. Like, if I can get that contact info, I will always ask them. And not everybody does it, but so I have as many of those conversations as I can, because it's so informative. Like, one phone call, you can learn so much, because I kind of have a set of things I ask, but then these conversations can go wherever. People always often have something they want to tell you. So you definitely want to be open to that, like whatever they might have to say. But yeah, I live for that. I love those conversations. I try to do as many of those as I can.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, it's very nice, because the sweet thing about that is, apart from getting the feedback and all that, is if you have the opportunity to speak to people that are actually listening to your show, what that does is that there are days where you feel like, oh, I shouldn't publish. Oh, this thing is really stressful. Then you start to imagine. It's not even a question of imagine. You see their faces. It pops up in your head like, oh yeah, John listens to my podcast. So it's not a thing of, oh, I get 1,000 downloads. Sometimes it's numbers, and it's a little bit different. Like, okay, yeah, 1, 2, 3, I've seen these persons, I've spoken to them, they listen to my show and they like it.
Right. Yeah, and you can learn stuff that you didn't, that you and you can really start to segment your audience a little bit as well, right? Because you can find that not everybody looks at your podcast the same way, and then you kind of have to decide, like, are there any people maybe I just can't serve them all? I'm going to have to make some selections, and you can at least have those kind of conversations in your head and be thinking about what that might look like, because there's some people listen for so many different reasons, I discover, and in so many different ways as well.
Yeah. We've talked about how the podcast is doing with regards to the purpose. Now, I want us to. It's been 3 years, right? The first time your first attempt at podcast, it was pretty scary. The picture that is painting in my head is kind of like okay, over here when it rains, right? Usually like when the first rain during the season, it's really very heavy, and then sometimes ice block, it falls and all that. And usually as kids, we love to like go into the rain, play, dance, run around and stuff like that. For some little kids, when they're about to step into the rain, there's this loud thunder, and they run back into their house.
Right.
So that's the picture that I'm painting. Like, when you start the podcast, everything that was just coming at you, and you're like, no, I need to take a break. And then it wasn't like, okay, it wasn't a question of, oh, I'm going to stop podcast. It was a question of, okay, what are things I need to learn? What are things I need to change? And then you learn from the experience, and you took a long rest, and you came back to podcast, and now you're doing it, and you've been doing it for 3 years now. And yeah, that's wonderful. What would you say are the things that podcasting has done to you? Kind of like, I'm expecting positive things, but if there are negative things too, I'd love to hear that. But like, how has it developed, improved, and really worked on you? Personal benefits, not monetary benefits, but really personal benefits.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, doing this show has really changed, the way I look at some of these problems, right? And it makes me, and speaking to all these experts, have really helped me, just realize that everything's more complicated than you think it is, right? And I think podcasting is an example of that, right? I mean, I think a lot of us like listen to the radio and go, "Hey, I could do that," or listen to somebody else's podcast and think, "Hey, I could do that."
Well,
And I
well,
was
that's okay.
naive, and I was naive like that as well. So I thought, yeah, that should be easy. I can do that. And then, and I'm still learning. There's so much, so much more room to get better and all that stuff. I'm not saying I've figured it all out, but I certainly, know a lot more about what it takes to do it now than I did when I started. And I think that's also true just in the space, this bridge building and toxic polarization world as well, and just this political environment in general. Like, I'm so much less sure I know stuff than I was before, right? I mean, I really think everything is a lot more complicated than you think it is. There's probably more to be, before you jump on your high horse and tell everybody else what to think. You probably need to research it a little more and understand there might be more to it than you first thought, things like that. So I think for one way that has changed me is I'm much more, or I guess I'm less certain about things and less quick to jump to conclusions and feeling solid that I really understand this thing and know what's going on. That's one way it's changed me. And is that negative? I don't think so, because we should probably all be a little more open-minded and not be so sure we know everything, right? So certainly with this podcast, that's one thing that's changed for me. But yeah, it has certainly changed. I've certainly learned a huge amount about, the podcast landscape. So I have another show that I do, which is more like a chat show, right? So I kind of have two extremes. I have the show that I do, which is kind of formal and serious and sciencey and edited and scripted and all that. And then I do this other show once a week with my wife that is just us kind of rambling, like the classic old podcast, from years ago that people did. And so, that's one thing
what's the name of this other show?
Oh, that second podcast is called This Week in Outrage. So we kind of talk about what was in the news, what was in the memes, what are people upset about this week, and we kind of try to make it kind of light and kind of, and don't worry about too much making it too serious. I mean, sometimes serious stuff comes up, but for the most part, we try to make it pretty light, and that show's pretty much unedited and all that. And I say that because this is one thing that's really cool about podcasting to me, is that it's what you want it to be. Like, a lot of times people are teaching these master classes and they're saying you must do this and you must do that and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, anytime I hear that, I'm like, I don't know. When people ask me these questions, there's nothing you have to do, right? I mean, you have to sort of record something and put it out. That's a podcast.
You don't have to. You could, but you don't have to.
Right. You
Do it,
could, but
bro.
you don't. Exactly. Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's a much better way to look at it. Like, here's the benefits of doing that. You might want to do it, but you really, the whole point of podcasting is you make the rules. Like, you decide what you want your show to be. And if everybody thinks that's dumb, then okay, but maybe you're doing, like, if we all did the same thing and we all said, oh, here's the script and here's the format and the way that we're all going to do it, they'd all be the same. Like, we'd have just a bunch of shows that were all the same. So I think the idea that we kind of throw out and throw out kind of bring our own style to it and do it the way we want to do is the whole point of the thing.
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, you're the chef of the podcast. It's your show. You call the shots. Whatever you want, it is. I like the different things that the podcast I've heard and listened to different podcasts. I've heard audio documentaries, audio drama, conversations, street interviews, like different things. So it's your show. Like, you do what you want, and that's the sweet thing. And it's also overwhelming, and it's also dangerous because there's so much things you could do that people end up asking and say, "What's the right thing I should be doing?"
Yeah. Yeah, it's like people, what's the best microphone? Well, there's a whole bunch of options, right? Like, there isn't one single best microphone for everybody,
Yeah.
or we'd all be using the same one.
Yeah. I feel like for every podcaster, depending on how often you publish and how intense you're into the podcast game, right? I feel like the first 6 to 1 year is meant for you to figure out the tools, the software, your workflows for you, the episode format, the topic, the everything is meant to figure out your own workflow, because that's 6 to 1 year, depending on how fast you are and how intense it is for you, right? Because some persons, they publish like once every 2 weeks or once every 1 week. So that kind of persons, it take a long time for them to actually like test things, because that first 6 months is really hard, because most of the things you're doing is what people say you should do, what people recommended on the blog post on YouTube channel, and that stuff is not working
Right.
out for you. And you're having a hard time, but you have to like realize that, okay, this thing is testing phase. I have to figure out, I have to explore, try out 5, 10 softwares and see which one works best for me. Try out Zoom, try out Riverside, try out all these things. And then eventually you find the one that works for you, because we don't want softwares and our tools to be working against us. We want them to work for us.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of those questions when people ask me that stuff is like, well, it kind of depends. Try them out. Try these 3 out and see which one works for you. Because the one works for me doesn't mean it's going to work for you. That kind of thing. And, people kind of want the single answer, but yeah, it doesn't work like that because some people love one tool and other people hate that tool, right? So you kind of just have to try it out and kind of what fits your personality.
Yeah, yeah. It's like food. Some persons they like this type of food. They're like, oh, this is my favorite food. I love this. And then you're like, are you serious? That stuff is garbage.
Yeah.
How do you even do that stuff? You need help. Oh, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, for sure.
But yeah, that's the way this they are. The funny thing most people don't understand is that this software, these tools, they were created for a specific user or customer in mind. And sometimes you have to ask yourself and you have to make decision and realize that, okay, I'm not a customer. Like I could say, oh, maybe you recommend Zoom. I'll say, okay, I have to use Zoom. I've tried Zoom and I know that stuff is not meant for me. And that's okay, because if I try to use Zoom, what if the process is going to be frustrating and we're going to end up recording podcast episode that I don't like? In fact, it's just going to be so hard. But now I use something I love, something I like, it works for me. And yeah, that's it. But then someone will hear me and say, oh, Riverside, that's the thing I need to use because that's what, to go and use what what works for you. You don't have to use Riverside. But if Riverside works for you, nice, but you don't have to use Riverside. Yeah. This is the part I love to talk about most times. And for some podcasts, it's different, and it's one that everyone wants to know about. It's like, does the podcast make money?
Well, yeah. Well, so I do. I don't do ads. I've decided I'm not going to do ads, so I don't even consider that an option. But I do allow people to contribute. Right. I think I'd be careful to use the word donate because I'm not a charity, but I'm not technically a charity. But I do allow people to contribute. And so I do have, some folks that do that. So it's not gonna, I'm not gonna, you're not gonna retire on that money, but it helps cover some of the costs, and it also shows the people are finding value in the show as well. So that's my only way of monetization today is people can contribute.
Okay. Could I? Yeah, I notice you are very specific with the choice of words you use. Could I also say you do allow people to support the show?
Right. Yeah.
Okay, so
Yeah. So you could do stuff like buy me a coffee or do a Substack subscription. Those are my 2 main ways that people contribute to the show.
okay, so you do buy me coffee and then Substack subscription. Oh, that's brilliant. Okay, Substack seems to be trending nowadays. Everywhere I look, I see one stuff about Substack. I do hope that it's not just one of those trending thing that that fizzles out in the next 2 to 3 months.
Yeah, I mean, you never know because it's not my platform. Who knows what where it can go. But so far, I've kind of found a home for my listeners. It seems like it has there's a good match between Substack readers and the content that I'm producing, and people like it. So that's probably been the most successful sort of off podcast platform for me. So I've kind of focused a little more, and I'm going to continue to even focus more energy there. But I'm going to probably continue to focus energy there because that seems to be the place where I get the most engagement.
Wow. Okay. Probably because a lot of journalists they use Substack. So the kind of things I know you said earlier on that you're not exactly a technical journalist, but the kind of things you do, it's pretty scientific analysis and all that. Even though it's not you that is doing the analysis, but you get to like guide the conversation and guide where they focus on and talk about. So people on Substack that read Substack, most of them they read journalistic writing. So it makes sense that they would want to listen to your podcast.
Yeah, it seems to have a good overlap.
Yeah. Something I'm curious to know is Podmatch. Does the platform Podmatch work for your kind of guest for your show?
Not a lot. I don't get too many guests through Podmatch because I'm often looking for very specific, researchers and scientists and academics who aren't really on Podmatch. But I use it to try to get on shows, and also, but I've had some interviews come through there that have been interesting. So mostly authors, right? That's probably the main type of guest that has come through Substack or Podmatch is authors, and it's also a platform that I do use for my workflows. Right, they have a tool on there called Workflows that is pretty simplified, but it's perfect for podcasting because you can kind of create more or less a to-do list for each episode, and it comes with the podcast the Podmatch subscription. So I do use that. It's their tool. You can find it in the Podmatch menu. It's called Workflows. I do use that.
Earlier on, at the beginning of the episode, you did mention how you got your guest, and your show is particularly unique that it's not exactly the kind of mainstream show that, because this is the most of the guests you invite into come on your podcast. These are not people that go to podcast, right? They would come on your podcast because they would just want to discuss your work for, probably because they like your show, or maybe your show is pretty niche and because you're interested in your work. And probably some of the times you're maybe the first podcaster that has reached out to them to have them come on your podcast. So I'm trying to like extrapolate everything you said so far. So we find their work, right? In your own case, it's the work what they've published, the journals they published. We find their and then we put them online, try to like stalk and sneak around and see how we can reach out, and then we message and do via LinkedIn, but email will be very very nice. But then LinkedIn and all that well, and back and forth, and then maybe 2 months later we have them on the podcast.
Right. Yeah, no, exactly. And I have a little bit of a backlog, although I'm working through it. So I'll try to shorten that gap between when I interview and when the podcast comes out. But yeah, you mentioned some folks have never been on shows. Yes, there's been several folks that I was the first podcast they went on, and that's always cool. And a couple folks have been like, after they came on my show, they got really popular in their field as well. So now they're like in demand. A bunch of podcasts want to have them on the show, right? But they were first on mine.
I think it's a nice thing when we find a way to get experts that are not in the mainstream media, because what happens is that I think there's this conundrum of echo chamber of noise where everybody's saying the same thing, and they're actually good, really really good experts. But these people, apart from the journals which nobody reads, other than those who are scientific, the journals, it's not for laymen, right? It's for professionals and people that actually know those stuff and really want to like read that stuff. Or in the mainstream content people consume, nobody hears or talks about the things they talk about. So when you have a podcast and you publish that stuff, guess what it happens? You get a kind of original content in that it's different for what is out there on that topic, because it's not what everyone is saying, and because and these persons don't even go on to podcast most of the time. Usually, the thing you talk about journal, most of the time, the work they work on is like very original, very specific projects. And so when they're talking about it, it's like the first time they're talking about it in mainstream media. Why am I? Why do I keep using mainstream media? But like in YouTube podcast, and so it's new, it's different, and yeah,
Yeah, and that's been fun, and it's great to see folks sort of be excited to hear themselves on a show somewhere, right? So that's kind of cool. And I mean, I think my show is a good middle ground, and that was kind of the point of it. But if some of this stuff goes out in like you say, sort of mainstream media, it's usually much more simplified. So they kind of get 2 minutes to talk about it, maybe 5 minutes at most, but often a couple of minutes, and they talk about their topic. Whereas on my show, we're looking like an hour, 45, let's just say half an hour to 40 minutes. I'm sort of shooting for that half an hour range, but it's not so overwhelmingly academic that nobody would want to listen to it. I try to get it down to a level that anybody with, some interest and some curiosity can understand it without having to know all the science. Because there are some shows that talk about this stuff, but they're kind of targeted to academic. So they go on for like for an hour and a half or 2 hours, on one of these topics. And it's very much in the language of academic to academic. It's not as approachable to just regular folks, right? It's not as accessible to regular folks. So I try to strike that balance between being accessible so anybody, can understand it, and anyone with curiosity can kind of figure it out. And it's also a little bit more in depth than what you're going to find on just one NPR segment or something like that, right? We can go in greater depth, so it's enough depth to really understand it as a layman, but also you don't have to be you don't have to be a scientist, and you're not going to be bored to death by two academics kind of blabbing on about it forever. I try to keep the pace going and make it more interesting.
yeah. Well, thank you so much. We talked about the money, we talked about the purpose, we talked about kind of like the personal impact, and I want us to look at what are some of the promotional strategies, like kind of like the growth strategies you've used in the past, and if you do have any promotional projections or crazy plans you intend to like work on over the course of maybe 3 6 months, 1 year, we would love to.
Yeah, I've tried some different things. I did a launch party. That was kind of like just friends and acquaintances and some people from the industry when I first started it. So that was kind of fun, and that got the show kind of kicked off at that point. So we did a whole physical launch party, like rented out a space, and put a party together. That kind of helped get the podcast at least initially kicked off. Um, and after that, for the most part, I'm pretty much doing the same stuff everybody's doing. I'm kind of trying to do some social media stuff here and there. I'm trying to do, I do live QAs sometimes to try to bring on some guests and bring on some experts and do like a live QA, just to try to get awareness of the show. That's been somewhat helpful at different times. I write on Substack. That seems to expose some of this work to new people. Now, not all of those people that read the writing become listeners to the podcast, because you certainly have learned that. Same thing on social media. I've learned that people consume the way they want to consume, and they're going to do what they're going to do. So, like, I have Instagram followers that admit they don't listen to the show; they just like the Instagram content. Right? They're never going to listen to a half-hour podcast. They just don't do that, but they like the Instagram content. Instagram content. And I have Substack readers that, well, I like what you write, but I don't listen to the show because I just like your writing. So they just read the stuff I write. So you kind of got to, I used to be kind of mad about that, but now I'm just like, you got to take the listeners where they are and where they want to be, right? And meet them where they are. So that's something I do with the Substack stuff. I have, well, I want to do more in person, promotional stuff, like, maybe some local events and things like that. And, maybe get involved in some science conferences and things like that. But I haven't really quite figured out, the best way to do that. But yeah, so I guess those are some of the main, I'm trying to think of some of the unusual stuff that I've done. I guess I'm just kind of doing most of the same thing everybody else does.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for sharing that. And thank you for sharing some of the behind the scenes. And well, hopefully, maybe in the next 6 months, I don't know what the stats are right now. I know what the podcasts are, yeah. But hopefully, in the next 6 months, everything works according to plan or even beyond plan, and everything is going well. And then I would love to have you back on the podcast to talk about some of the detailed, specific stuff. Right now, I feel like it's just an introduction. We're just getting to know, oh, this is what the podcast is about. Oh, this is it. And then later on, we can then say, okay, yeah, I did do this crazy experiment with my podcast, and this is what happened.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so each year I kind of, or even more often, but I'll try to review things and see if there is some shakeups I want to do. Right. So you mentioned audio documentaries before. So I started to do more of those. My first one was kind of last year. And so now they're a lot of work, so I can only do so many a year, but I'm starting to do more of those. So I squeeze in some audio documentaries every, once in a while, as many as I can do a year, which is maybe 3 or 4.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and yeah, that's the sweet thing. If you're sources, there's so many other aspects of the podcast. You just like get someone to do the editing, you focus on the research, and then probably reading the script, and then yeah, it's eventually we'll get there. But we'll have to work with what we have. So yeah, thank you so much, David, sharing your podcast story with us on the podcast. It's been an amazing 50 minutes.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate it. Thanks for making the time and
Where
having me
can
on.
listeners learn more about you and
You want to name the show again? Yeah. So the podcast is called Outrage Overload. Sometimes people hear me say Outrage Overlord, but it's not that. It's Outrage Overload, like a overloaded truck. So Outrage Overload, and the website is outrageoverload.net.
okay? Yeah. Thank you so much once again for sharing your podcast story with us on the podcast, and it's been fun.
Yeah, it's been great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, please, if there any improvements, anything you love told us, let us know, and just
Oh,
shoot
I
me an
appreciate
email.
that.
I'm glad to book a time and continue.
Awesome. Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.
That's it for today's episode of my podcast story. I am Wisdom Okonkwo, and I hope this conversation sparked new ideas and gave you a deeper look into the heart of podcasting. If you've loved this episode, consider supporting the show by buying me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/wisdomhq. Every bit helps keep the stories going. And hey, don't forget to follow, rate, and share this podcast with another podcaster or creator who would find it helpful. Thanks again for listening, and I'll catch you in the next episode.